The history of Windsor and its development is extremely complicated, and this is my personal interpretation of what we see around us and what we're told as locals. I grew up in Windsor, I lived here for 40 years, and I believe that I know something about this place. I may get it right, I may get it wrong, but I find it really interesting. I'm going to share that with you now. In the 1970s and 80s, when I was a kid growing up in Windsor, entrance to the castle was free, but we never used to appreciate that, and we should have, because now the place is unfortunately very highly commercialised, and an adult ticket for entry is £26.50, so it's really not cheap to visit. Having paid your £26.50, you now enter through this building at the top here and have to pass through an airport-styled security system before being able to explore the castle itself. Most tourists will want to rightly spend time in the fabulous staterooms, but I am more interested in trying to trace, in my very amateur way, the development of the castle itself. And so I think the best place to start is the very earliest stages of the castle, the foot of the Round Tower. The oldest visible part of the castle is now in front of us, and no, it is not the Round Tower, which in its current form was a George IV addition in about 1829, but rather the mound or motte that it actually sits on. The original fort here was established by William the Conqueror in about 1070, and he had this entirely man-made mound or motte constructed, and on the top he placed a simple wooden fort called a bailey, which was effectively a building surrounded by a wooden fence or a palisade. The motte itself was constructed from material excavated from around the motte to form a ditch or dry moat, and this is still very visible today on the south and west side of the motte, but has been infilled to the north and east. This can be seen here in the reduced height of this gate. I don't know the age of this gate itself, but it was never originally constructed at this height and gives some idea how successive development, in particular during the reign of George IV, has raised the land height on this side of the Round Tower. In about 1260, King Henry II was the first king to really start development of the castle beyond the wooden fort that stood on top of this motte. Henry built the first stone round tower on the top of the motte, replacing the wooden fort, though it was significantly lower in its height than the current one, and he also built the first curtain wall, stone towers with a wall in between, or the outside castle wall to the east of the motte, now seen as part of that much modified wall at the end of the quadrangle, and to our right, beside and opposite the current state apartments, which are to the left. This wall was constructed out of flint, as was the round tower, a material which is not currently seen in much of the castle. The left side of where we're looking, the current state apartments, were less of an issue defensively, as there is a steep drop of 30 metres down the chalk cliff to the river. King Henry III furthered his grandfather's construction of the castle as a defensive structure, with the construction of the western curtain or outer wall in 1227. And this is in fact the majority of the famous wall now seen from Windsor High Street. As part of this construction, Henry built the famous Curfew Tower or Clock Tower seen at the end of this wall, which originally housed the royal dungeons. However, in 1478 bells were added to the top and a clock in 1689. Along with the motte, dating from 1070, this curtain wall, which is visible from the High Street and built in 1227, represents a big part of the oldest surviving part of the castle that we can see today in its fairly original form. However, the French-styled conical roof that we can see on the clock tower was a later addition added by George IV. Henry III also built a great hall and residence, royal residence, down in the lower ward of the castle, just behind where the current St George's Chapel stands, in what I've always considered to be the Tudor area of the castle. Unfortunately, this building was levelled by the Tudors in the 15th century. It was only when I got home and I did further research that I realised by luck I'd managed to actually film part of the wall of Henry's hall, and it is here by the tree to the right, and found in a Time Team dig I'll mention later in 2006, and again here to the left of the tree. The wall of the hall was built into the Tudor buildings. The next major development of the castle occurred during the reign of Edward III from 1350. Edward embarked on a 25-year building plan for the castle. He demolished most of the existing castle, with the exception of the Curfew Tower and the western curtain wall, and then rebuilt within the existing plan, enhancing greatly the defensive capabilities of the castle. He rebuilt the round tower on the motte and built the Norman gate that we see here, connected to the Round Tower and the Edward III Tower on the other side of the Motte by a defensive wall which we can see running up the Motte and down the other side. He also relocated the royal residences to the top of the castle, to the upper ward, where they remain to this day. Edward also had the chapel, which has always stood on the site of the current St George's Chapel, rebuilt, although this is not the chapel that we see today. Most interestingly, in 1348, Edward III established the Order of the Garter, which was meant to emulate the Arthurian legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I'm not, to be honest, really interested in the quadrangle itself, which we're looking at now, because it was a creation of George IV in the 1820s. But it is interesting because Edward built here a round table and housed that in a round building of 200 feet diameter, which was unique in the medieval world. This building stood to the far right corner of the quadrangle as we look at it and ran under the current towers on the corner of the wall. It emulated an age of chivalry and legend. There was a Time Team royal dig.
From the Queen's ceremonial lawn in Windsor, extraordinary news about what the Knights of the Round Table got up to in their spare time.
Where they actually excavated this building and found the foundations of this 200-foot round building that Edward III built. They also excavated the Great Hall down in the lower ward that Henry III had built, and I would really recommend watching these programmes. They're available on YouTube. In 1390, during the reign of Richard II, the then St George's Chapel was found to be close to collapse. Restoration was hastily commissioned, and a certain Geoffrey Chaucer was tasked with rebuilding of the chapel. Unfortunately, whilst being a really good storyteller, Chaucer turned out not to be a very good builder, and his restoration lasted barely 50 years before the chapel itself actually collapsed. As a result of this collapse, Edward IV began construction of the current St George's Chapel as we know it, towards the end of his reign in 1475. As anyone who has visited this amazing building knows, it is not really a chapel, and it's incorrect really to describe it as one. It is much more of a cathedral and a mausoleum, holding the bodies of no less than 10 former monarchs. It is not a cathedral because the chapel does not contain a high cathedra or seat of the bishop, which is necessary for any building to be considered a cathedral. But its location, scale and grandeur make it a cathedral in anything but name. From this point forward in development, the purpose of the castle really changes. Future developments really focus on increasing the comfort of the castle as a royal residence and not so much on the defensive capabilities of the castle. However, the construction of the main gate, which is still the current main gate, in 1510 by Henry VIII, strangely called the Henry VIII Gate, was both. Creation of the gate created a grand entrance for the king to the castle, but also moved the main entrance of the castle away from the Norman Gate and the royal residences. This made it much safer for Henry. Henry also built the first terrace along the top of the chalk cliff towards the north of the castle, though at the time this was a simple wooden walkway. Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, loved Windsor Castle and spent much of her time here. Though the changes Elizabeth made to the castle were minor, I think she built two of the most interesting features currently still visible in broadly original form. Just inside the Norman Gate, Elizabeth built this Tudor residence with a long gallery, and just outside and to the north of this building, the current stone terrace to replace the wooden walkway of her father. I love this sandstone Tudor building with its Tudor motifs and the fact that it survived George IV's remodelling of the upper ward. Elizabeth apparently liked to walk along the stone terrace when the weather was fine and exercised in the long gallery within this Tudor building when it was not. This building now houses the castle library. This is also a great point to look at the two major stone materials used in the construction of the castle throughout its history. The key grey stone that we see in the walls and defensive structures is called Reigate stone. Reigate itself is about 50 miles southeast of Windsor, and the stone was, and remains, expensive. Reigate stone was mined underground on the North Downs, hence its high cost. Reigate stone was a perfect stone for the construction of the walls and the defensive areas of this castle. It's locally available, and it's a high-quality silica quartz stone, and its structure makes it easy to work and yet highly durable, resistant to attack, whether from military means or from the weather. The second stone we see used extensively in the construction of the castle is a sandstone, a much softer stone that can be seen in many of the decorative mouldings and decorative features around the castle. It is a soft stone which is unfortunately easy to carve, but also can be easily weathered. We can see here that sandstone was used in the 13th century to construct the decorative elements of the Norman gate, but it has not fared well and has failed badly when compared to the surrounding harder Reigate freestone. And when you look around the castle, you can see that many of the cartouches and decorative elements made from sandstone have weathered poorly and have deteriorated over time because of the choice of stone here. There is also a third stone that was used in the original construction of Windsor Castle, a flint from nearby Bagshot, and this was used in the construction of the original stone round tower, which was then knocked down and replaced by Edward III. Flint is commonly found in walls around the castle constructed after the demolition of the original round tower. After the reign of Elizabeth, Windsor Castle went into some decline. During the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651, it was captured and held by the parliamentarians. The new model army was headquartered in the castle, and the castle suffered as a symbol of the royalist enemy. It was also used as a prison for the most important royalists captured at the time. Indeed, before his execution in 1649, Charles I was imprisoned in the castle, though he was allowed to wander the grounds of the castle, so house arrest is perhaps a more appropriate description of his time at Windsor. After his execution, Charles's body was smuggled back to Windsor in the dead of night and buried without ceremony in the crypt of St. George's Chapel. After the restoration of the monarchy, Windsor Castle was very much developed as a royal palace. Charles II laid out the Long Walk in about 1670, as at this time Versailles was being built in France, and Charles II and following kings used Windsor and its subsequent development as a counter to this palace to maintain their international prestige. The Long Walk runs for 3 miles to Snow Hill in the Great Park. The statue at the end, called the Copper Horse, was erected by George IV. It is of his father, George III, and the plinth was intentionally constructed to look like a ruined, damaged edifice. I know this statue really well, as when I was a kid I used to go to school near the park, and we used to be made to run to this statue and back once a week. After the death of Charles in 1685, the Royal Court moved to Hampton Court along the Thames, and it was not until the reign of George III and in 1804 that the castle was occupied again as a royal residence. Charles himself had rebuilt much of the Tudor staterooms along the North Terrace, and George again remodelled these into a more Gothic style. King George III, of course, infamously went mad, and it was during this madness that he was effectively imprisoned at Windsor Castle for the duration of the rest of his life and the regency of George IV. Throughout this short video, I have mentioned George IV, and it was during his reign from 1820 to 1830 that the castle underwent its largest transformation, most of what we currently see today. I have been looking carefully at the castle to try and identify the older elements of its history before George got to it. George's modifications to the castle took 12 years. He completely remodelled the upper ward, creating the quadrangle and the buildings we see today. He had the round tower demolished and rebuilt, rising the height from 3 metres to over 9. He also created the south facade, as seen from the Long Walk, and the now famous George IV gate at the top of that Long Walk. George also added battlements to the top of St. George's Chapel and remodelled many of the existing buildings to create a symmetry and consistent style across the castle that we see today. He added French-style pitched roofs to the western curtain wall to mirror those of Versailles. Much of the interior of the castle was also remodelled at this time in a very similar Gothic style. Before we finish this video, I want to go out into Windsor and have a look at a couple of the famous streets here. And also, I want to look at the other institution that's so famous with Windsor, that of Eton College. In the year 1800, the population of Windsor was recorded as 3,200 people only. It was only in the 19th century that the town grew and expanded westwards. To this point, the history of the town can be traced in the development of 6 Windsor Streets. The first and oldest 3 streets in Windsor were Castle Street, Peascod Street and River Street. These were the 2 main roads into Windsor, and the Castle Street itself adjoined these, leading obviously to the castle. Peascod Street, now pedestrianised, would likely have been the main thoroughfare up the chalk hill to the castle, and as such the first proper road in Windsor. In 1308 its name was recorded as Peascod Street. It is now the main shopping street in the town, along with River Street, and the adjoining land found between the 2 streets now forms the Royal Windsor Arcade, which is within the Royal Station, and also King Edward Court Shopping Centre. The Royal Windsor Station is noteworthy for a number of reasons, but one of them is that there was actually an attempted assassination of Queen Victoria at this site on March 2nd, 1882. The Queen had arrived by train from London and had just entered her carriage when a gentleman named Roderick Frederick Maclean took out a gun and tried to shoot her. He fortunately missed and was hustled to the ground by 2 Eton scholars named Wilson and Robinson, who were declared to be brave and stalwart boys. Boys were met with a tremendous ovation of applause from both their college student chums and the teachers when they returned to Eton later that day. Maclean himself was found not guilty but insane and spent the rest of his life in a mental institution. River Street, unsurprisingly, runs from Castle Street along the castle walls to the bridge over the River Thames to Eton, and was the other main route into Windsor and up to the castle. There has been a bridge over the River Thames at this point since at least 1172, and it operated as a toll bridge. It's highly likely that the first parts of Windsor Town grew up around this bridge and outside the castle gate itself. The current bridge was built and opened in 1824 and finally closed to traffic in 1970, forever closing the road between Windsor and Eton to traffic. In 1822, the current Windsor Parish Church of St John the Baptist on Windsor High Street opened. It is on the site of previous churches dating back to the time of Henry II, with the first church likely having been built on this site in about 1150. This church introduces us to 2 further original streets: Church Street, which runs directly from opposite the Henry VIII gate, outside the castle, to the church itself, and the High Street, running from the intersection of Castle Street and Thames Street and Peascod Street towards the Windsor Great Park and the hunting grounds of ancient times. The houses and buildings on Church Street are almost without exception dating from the latter part of the 17th or the early 18th century. They give us a glimpse back in time to the architecture of the earlier Windsor town. The red brick buildings seen on this street are late 17th century. The famous mistress of Charles II, Nell Gwynn, lived in this building on the left, which was connected directly to the castle by a tunnel that still exists to this day. Most of the old buildings on the High Street and Peascod Street have long since been demolished, but the walk down the High Street towards the Great Park, or in the other direction, back up towards the castle, are both well worth exploring, with the parish church of St John situated halfway along its length and the Guildhall on this street towards the castle. At the end of the High Street we find Park Street, the 6th street in our original Windsor plan, or as it was once called, Pound Street. The houses here are amongst the most expensive in Windsor, and the houses here date, largely unchanged, from the end of the 1700s. They are almost exclusively brick built, with some Doric decoration. Park Street, unsurprisingly, leads out onto Windsor Great Park at the top of the Long Walk. As we turn and walk back down the High Street, I want to stop and talk about the Guildhall, which we see here on the right. The Guildhall, as we see it, was built in 1678 and is famous because it hosted the recent weddings of Charles III and Queen Consort Camilla, and also Elton John and David Furness. If you listen to many of the guides and locals, it was designed and constructed by Sir Christopher Wren, the famous architect who built St Paul's Cathedral in London after the Great Fire. The story goes that during the construction of the Guildhall, the council became concerned about its structural integrity. They felt that the space between the pillars was too big, and Wren was required to put central columns into the Guildhall to support the roof in the middle. He, however, knew these were unnecessary, so he left a gap at the top of these pillars, and we can see these to this day. This is a great local story, but in actual fact it's wrong in almost every detail. It's a local myth and illustrates the challenge that we have in really understanding Windsor and its history. The Guildhall was built between 1687 and 1690, but it was not designed and built by Sir Christopher Wren. It was actually built by a gentleman called Sir Thomas Fitch. Unfortunately, Sir Thomas Fitch died in late 1697, about 6 months before the completion of the Guildhall, and it is possible that the final elements of construction may have been supervised by Wren, although there is absolutely no documentary evidence of this at all. Christopher Wren's son, also called Christopher Wren, was the MP for Windsor, and he did make some additions to the Guildhall itself and had his name put on it. So this is where this myth may have arisen from. What about the central pillars though? They are there and there's a gap. Well, the finished Guildhall actually had no central pillars, and we can see this as evidenced by this 18th century painting, which is held in the museum behind the Guildhall. In 1829, the rear rooms that we see with the museum were added to the existing column building that was in front, the Corn Exchange, and it is believed that at the time, the builder decided to relocate the rear pillars, which he no longer required, to the centre of the structure rather than dispose of them. But to this day, they serve no structural purpose, and there is actually an argument to say they should be removed. They spoil the original building that Fitch designed. There is also a fantastic little museum housed on the ground floor in the rooms at the back of the Guildhall, which was opened by Queen Elizabeth II in 2011. Unlike most things in Windsor, unfortunately, it is free, and I'd highly recommend visiting it. It's staffed by really friendly people as well, who grew up in Windsor and know their stuff. I had a good long chat with them, and we shared some stories of the past. The modern Windsor Castle is approached from the town past the famous statue of Queen Victoria. This was erected in 1887 to commemorate her Golden Jubilee and cost £2,500 at the time, which was raised by the local community. What most people looking at this statue, however, don't know is what previously stood on this site for at least 400 years before the statue itself, the town gallows. And we can evidence this 400 years because in 1536, a local butcher from Windsor is being documented as hung at the new town gallows across the castle ditch, just down the hill from the main gate of the castle. As we get down to the bridge, we see this fantastic building containing the Sir Christopher Wren Hotel. The Wren family had a long association with Windsor, with Sir Christopher Wren's father being Dean of the Castle and his son being an MP for Windsor. But the hotel and the building it occupies have nothing to do with any of them, rather like the Guildhall that we discussed earlier. Crossing over the bridge, we enter Eton High Street, once one of the main thoroughfares into Windsor itself, and hence lined with buildings dating from the medieval period. The oldest building found on Eton High Street dates to 1465 and is currently occupied by a Chinese restaurant. Eton is often forgotten by the visiting tourists to Windsor, but it is very rewarding to stroll the half-mile or so along Eton High Street until you reach the buildings of the world-famous Eton College itself. This is a school where many British and foreign kings and prime ministers have studied, including the current Prince of Wales, Prince William, and his slightly wayward brother, Prince Harry, or Henry by his proper name. The school itself was founded by King Henry IV in 1440, meaning that the school itself predates the current St George's Chapel, found in the castle, by approximately 35 years. The school was originally called the King's College of Our Lady of Eton, besides Windsor, and had 70 students initially who lived in the school and were educated for free. Many of the buildings we see now within the college were completed in the 1500s, but it is no longer a free school for the poor, as it was originally intended. If you wish your son, because the school only accepts males, not daughters, to attend, and assuming they can pass the vigorous entrance exams, then you will need to pay more than £40,000 a year per child for the privilege. Of course, Eton's uniform of tailcoats is almost as famous as the school itself, and until the Second World War, the uniform also included a top hat. It was found, however, during this period that the top hat interfered with putting on a gas mask, so it was abandoned at this time as part of the regular daily uniform. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed my little history walk of Windsor. I have more videos on Windsor coming up. They will not be as detailed as this one, but I hope you watch them and watch some of my other videos, and I really appreciate you staying with me for this long. Thank you.